In a month, no man had traveled up or down this silent creek. The man went steadily ahead. He was not much of a thinker. At that moment, he had nothing to think about except that he would eat lunch at the stream's divide, and that at 6 o'clock he would be in camp with the boys. There was nobody to talk to, and had there been, speech would not have been possible because of the ice around his mouth. Once in a while, the thought repeated itself that it was very cold and that he had never experienced such cold. As he walked along, he rubbed his face and nose with the back of his mittened hand. He did this without thinking, frequently changing hands. But with all his rubbing, the instant he stopped, his face and nose became numb. His face would surely be frozen. He knew that, and he was sorry that he had not worn the sort of nose guard Bud wore when it was cold. Such a guard passed across the nose and covered the entire face. But it did not matter much, he decided. What was a little frost? A bit painful, that was all. It was never serious. That's an interesting line, too. It shows the ignorance of the man. Is frost sometimes serious? Yeah, it is. Empty as the man's mind was of thoughts, he was most observant. He noticed the changes in the creeks, the curves and bends, and always he noticed where he placed his feet. Once, coming around a bend, he moved suddenly to the side like a frightened horse. He curved away from the place where he had been walking and retraced his steps several feet along the trail. He knew the creek was frozen to the bottom. No creek could contain water in that winter. But he knew also that there were streams of water that came out of the hillsides and ran along under the snow and on top of the ice of the creek. He knew that even in the coldest weather, these streams were never frozen, and he also knew their danger. They had pools of water under the snow that might be 3 inches deep or 3 feet. Sometimes a skin of ice, half an inch thick, covered them, and in turn was covered by the snow. Sometimes there was both water and thin ice, and when a man broke through, he could get very wet. Obviously, this is foreshadowing. Future events are going to have something to do with the stream. You can tell that from the way this is structured. I would say that we're still in the exposition, by the way. We have elements of rising action here. We're getting more and more information about how cold it is and some of the dangers that he's facing and about the dog, but we really haven't had an initiating event. There isn't one thing that's happened that set this off on a meaningful way. Because before the story started, he was already on his way to Henderson Creek. And so he's not, there. He didn't make a choice during the course of the story, I should say. That was why he jumped away so suddenly. He had felt the ice move under his feet. He had heard the noise of the snow-covered ice skin breaking. Ice skin is a personification for anybody who's trying to put that in there. The skin of ice, you'd sort of get what's going on there. Obviously, ice doesn't have real skin. And to get his feet wet in such a temperature meant trouble and danger. At the very least, it meant delay, because he would be forced to stop and build a fire. Hey, that's the title. Something important is going on here. Clearly, we're foreshadowing future events. Only under its protection could he bare his feet while he dried his socks and moccasins. He stood and studied the creek bottom and its banks. He decided that the flowing stream of water came from the right side. He thought a while, rubbing his nose and face. Then he walked to the left. He stepped carefully and tested the ice at each step. Once away from the danger, he continued at his 4-mile pace. During the next 2 hours, he came to several similar dangers. Usually the snow above the pools had a shrunken appearance. However, once again, he came near falling through the ice. Once, sensing danger, he made the dog go ahead. But the dog did not want to go. It hesitated until the man pushed it forward. Then it went quickly across the white, unbroken surface. Suddenly, it fell through the ice, but climbed out on the other side, which was firm. It had wet its feet and legs. Almost immediately, the water on them turned to ice. The dog made quick efforts to get the ice off its legs. Then it lay down on the snow and began to bite out the ice that had formed between its toes. The animal knew enough to do this. To permit the ice to remain would mean sore feet. It did not know this. It merely obeyed the commands that arose from the deepest part of its being. So here's a juxtaposition. You guys remember juxtaposition means contrast between the man and the dog. The dog understands the dangers of cold and water and ice on a sort of physical level, on an instinctual level. It doesn't understand it on an intellectual level. The man understands the dangers of the cold on an intellectual level, but he doesn't have the emotional attachment that the dog does. And so, anyway, and what kind of a jerk is this guy? Like, let me push the dog forward and see what happens. I've got 2 dogs. If that bothered anybody else, it bothered me too. Anyway, but the man knew these things, having learned from experience. He removed the mitten from his right hand and helped the dog tear out the pieces of ice. I guess he's got a little compassion. There's that. Maybe that's characterization too. He did not bare his fingers more than a minute and was surprised to find that they were numb. It certainly was cold. we get these little statements here and there. It certainly was cold. So clearly the guy is having some realizations about the dangers of the temperature, but he's subverting them and not thinking about them. He pulled on the mitten quickly and beat the hand across his breast. At 12 o'clock, the day was its brightest, yet the sun did not appear in the sky. At 12:30, on the minute, he arrived at the divide of the creek. He was pleased at his rate of speed. If he continued, he would certainly be with the boys by 6 o'clock that evening. Pause again. So the guy is accurate, his arrogance is founded on some, success. He clearly made it exactly on time to where he said he was going to make it. He unbuttoned his jacket and shirt and pulled forth his lunch. The action took no more than a quarter of a minute, yet in that brief moment, the numbness touched his bare fingers. Now, numbness means lack of feeling. Imagine, you have, you've been to the dentist and you've got Novocaine, and you know that numbness. That numbness comes with cold, too. It's like your skin's dying, like you can't feel anything with his fingers. And how long was it? A quarter of a minute? 15 seconds? It cleared... Wait, I lost my spot. The numbness touched his bare fingers. He did not put the mitten on, but instead struck his fingers against his leg. Then he sat down on a snow-covered log to eat. The pain that followed the striking of his fingers against his leg ceased so quickly that he was frightened. He had not had time to take a bite of his lunch. He struck the fingers repeatedly and returned them to the mitten. Then he bared the other hand for the purpose of eating. He tried to take a mouthful, but the ice around his mouth prevented him. Then he knew what was wrong. He had forgotten to build a fire and warm himself. He laughed at his own foolishness. As he laughed, he noted the numbness in his bare fingers. Also, he noted that the feeling which had first come to his toes when he sat down was already passing away. He wondered whether the toes were warm or whether they were numb. He moved them inside the moccasins and decided that they were numb. He pulled the mitten on hurriedly and stood up. He was somewhat frightened. He stamped forcefully until the feeling returned to his feet. It certainly was cold, was his thought. Now, we've repeated that thought a number of times. Clearly, London is trying to make an impact on the reader, right? He wants you to really consider how cold it is, and by repeating it multiple times, you really get that sense. The man from Sulphur Creek had spoken the truth when telling how cold it sometimes got in this country, and he had laughed at him at the time. Pause again. So, this is the first time we get advice from before the story happened. There was some man at a place called Sulphur Creek that had offered him advice not to travel in the cold, and he had laughed at him at the time. So that's more arrogance, more hubris to laugh at this old man who had given him advice. Also, Sulphur Creek, it's probably just a place in the Yukon, but sulfur is connected with, like hell and underground and stuff like that. So is it an allusion? Maybe. Certainly it's an allusion to a place. Is it an allusion to some sort of biblical something? I don't know. You might go there if you wanted to. Anyway, and he had laughed at him at the time. That showed one must not be too sure of things. There was no mistake about it. It was cold. He walked a few steps, stamping his feet and waving his arms, until reassured by the returning warmth. Then he took some matches and proceeded to make a fire. In the bushes, the high water had left a supply of sticks. From here he got wood for his fire. Working carefully from a small beginning, he soon had a roaring fire. Bending over the fire, he first melted the ice from his face. With the protection of the fire's warmth, he ate his lunch. For a moment, the cold had been forced away. The dog took comfort in the fire, lying at full length, close enough for warmth and far enough away to escape being burned. When the man had finished eating, he filled his pipe with tobacco and had a comfortable time with the smoke. Then he pulled on his mittens, settled his cap firmly about his ears, and started along the creek trail toward the left. Pause. So what does the fire symbolically represent? Clearly, it holds nature at bay. It's a comfort. It's a warmth. It's protection. I think this phrase, protection of the fire, is even there. Only the man can make it. The dog cannot. The dog has learned to follow the man because of the fire, because the fire keeps him safe. And so we've got this powerful symbol of the fire being a protection against the dangers of nature. And so maybe it does represent civilization. Maybe it does represent knowledge. The same sort of things it represents in Prometheus. That keeps humanity alive even though they have no other gifts like the fur of the dog or the warmth or the instincts that other animals have. Anyway, here's another juxtaposition, another contrast with the dog. The dog was sorry to leave and looked toward the fire. This man did not know cold. Possibly none of his ancestors had known cold, real cold. But the dog and all his family knew. And it knew that it was not good to walk outside in such fearful cold. It was the time to lie in a hole in the snow and to wait for this awful cold to stop. There was no real bond between the dog and the man. I think that's an important line. What does the dog symbolize here? Is it nature? It's a wolf dog. Is it some sort of halfway between nature and civilization? Is that what domestication is, or is this dog giving us nature's perspective as the narrator goes into the dog's mind? I think there's a lot of ways you can go with this and things you can think about, but London obviously included a dog and gave us the dog's mental process as a point of juxtaposition or contrast with the man to allow us to see two views and judge which one is right. There was no real bond between the dog and the man. The one was the slave of the other. If he represents nature, that's an interesting statement. The dog made no effort to indicate its fears to the man. It was not concerned with the well-being of the man. It was for its own sake that it looked toward the fire. But the man whistled and spoke to it with the sound of the whip in his voice. There's a metaphor. What does this imply about the man, too, with the sound of the whip in his voice? Has he whipped the dog before? Certainly the dog has been whipped by a man before, whether it's this man or not. But I think that's interesting. So the dog started walking close to the man's heels and followed him along the trail. The man put more tobacco in his mouth and started a new growth of yellow ice on his face. Again, his moist breath quickly powdered the hair on his face with white. He looked around him. There did not seem to be so many pools of water under the snow on the left side of Henderson Creek, and for half an hour the man saw no signs of any. And then it happened. Pause. This is a phrase which is a transitional phrase. And then it happened. It builds the pressure. Here comes our initiating event. We've been waiting a long time for a true initiating event. It happened is the initiating event. At a place where there were no signs, the man broke through. It was not deep. He was wet to the knees before he got out of the water to the firm snow. Now let's go back to the title. What's the title of this thing? To Build a Fire. Clearly, this is where it comes in. He was angry and cursed his luck aloud. He had hoped to get into camp with the boys at 6 o'clock, and this would delay him an hour. Now he would have to build a fire, all right? And dry his moccasins and socks. This was most important at that low temperature. He knew that much. So he turned aside to the bank, which he climbed. On top, under several small pine trees, he found some firewood, which had been carried there by the high water of last year. There were some sticks, but also larger branches and some dry grasses. He threw several large branches on top of the snow. This served for a foundation and prevented the young flame from dying in the wet snow. He made a flame by touching a match to a small piece of tree bark that he took from his pocket. This burned even better than paper. Placing it on the foundation, he fed the young flame with pieces of dry grass and with the smallest dry sticks. Fed the young flame is personification, by the way. Flame can't be young, it can't be fed, it can't eat. But this is all ways we figuratively talk about it to make it seem alive. He worked slowly and carefully, realizing his danger. Gradually, as the flames grew stronger, he increased the size of the sticks with which he fed it. He sat in the snow, pulling the sticks from the bushes under the tree and feeding them directly to the flame. He knew he must not fail. When it is 75 below zero, a man must not fail in his first attempt to build a fire. This is especially true if his feet are wet. If his feet are dry and he fails, he can run along the trail for half a mile to keep his blood moving, but the blood in wet and freezing feet cannot be kept moving by running when it is 75 degrees below. No matter how fast he runs, the wet feet will freeze even harder. So again, is this another Prometheus connection? You need to have the fire to survive. I don't want to bore you. All this the man knew. The old man on Sulphur Creek had told him about it, and now he was grateful for the advice. Already, feeling had gone from his feet. To build the fire, he had been forced to remove his mittens, and the fingers had quickly become numb. His pace of 4 miles an hour had kept his heart pushing the blood to all parts of his body, but the instant he stopped, the action of the heart slowed down. He now received the full force of the cold. So I think it's interesting, too, that we get more and more of what the man at Sulphur Creek told him over the course of the story. Clearly, this man, this main character, the protagonist, had more knowledge than we're led to believe up until this point. And we just haven't been fed it by the narrator. Now we find out that he knew more than just, don't go out in the cold. He knew the reasons why, and he neglected them. He now received the full force of the cold. The blood of his body drew back from it. The blood was alive, like the dog. Like the dog, it wanted to hide and seek cover away from the fearful cold. As long as he walked 4 miles an hour, the blood rose to the surface. But now it sank down into the lowest depths of his body. His feet and hands were the first to feel its absence. His wet feet froze first, His bare fingers were numb, although they had not yet begun to freeze. Nose and face were already freezing, while the skin of all his body became